Much like the rest of them, the shutter and lens combination that came with Winston needed just a little bit of love. The lens is a Kodak Anastigmat 8.5-inch f4.5 made in Rochester, New York in the United States around 1930 or 1934. I actually managed to find the lens in an old Kodak catalog from 1942 that shows it is a number 34. It has 4 elements in 2 groups. And this actually solved a bit of mystery for me and some of my friends, as it shows the maximum negative size that this lens will cover is a 5x8. Now I'm shooting it on an 8x10, and strangely enough, it rarely vignettes, usually only when I have quite a bit of front standard fall. So still a little bit of a mystery on exactly how this lens works. Overall, the lens was in great shape physically, no real scratches or anything detrimental, just very dirty, had some fungus and some condensation on the inside. I'm not exactly sure if that was oil or water. Now the shutter from Winston is what makes him extremely special. It is a Packard Shutter Company, or Packard Ideal Shutter Company number 6, and that makes it more or less a standardized camera shutter. It operates on a bulb, and well, we'll get into exactly all that here in just a second. So we'll begin by unscrewing the lens from the front of the lens flange. The lens itself is extremely simple. It's what's called a barrel lens. It has no shutter inside, only aperture blades. And you'll be able to tell here in just a second, I find the aperture blades on this lens absolutely hypnotic. The front elements simply unscrew. And now we have our first look at those absolutely beautiful aperture blades. They have a little bit of oil on them, but I actually don't do too much maintenance, as they actually work really, really well. Squeaky squeaky on the rear elements. Again, just gorgeous. Now to clean the elements of the lens, I first give them a nice dust off with the air duster, and then I use my Zeiss wipes that I'm sure you've seen me use on quite a few other camera restorations. They're not the cheapest, and then again, they're not the most expensive either, but they do a fantastic job of cleaning off virtually anything from the elements of a glass lens without damaging any coatings. Cleaning the rear element here, always start at the center and work your way out. The cleaner from the Zeiss wipes evaporates completely. At this point I thought that the rear element actually would separate, because I had noticed this ring around the circumference of the element itself, but apparently it does not separate, and it had no marks for a spanner wrench either. That's that ring I was referring to. I almost think that was put there intentionally. This was more than likely a portrait lens that might have added some peripheral blur. I really don't know. Cleaning the front elements now. Dusting out the aperture blades. I had considered dunking this whole thing in some isopropyl alcohol just to clean it off and re-oiling it, but again, it worked very smoothly. Everything seemed to be in good shape, no rust, so I left it as is. Replacing the elements now, they simply screw back into place. It was here I thought I had reversed the elements, but everything was just fine. Beautiful. And again, those aperture blades, my God. This is interesting. That dot, and in fact all those little black specks you can see in the lens elements are actual physical bubbles. This was very common in lenses of this vintage, but strangely enough, it affects the image quality absolutely zero. Give the outside of the lens barrel a good once over with the Zeiss wipe, and much like you saw in the actual restoration of Winston, whoever had this camera must have been quite a heavy smoker, because the entire outside of the lens was covered in nicotine and tar. I opened up a brand new microfiber lens cloth to give the outside of the lens element one last little wipe. Take away any smudges, anything that was possibly left by the wet wipe, and that glass is nearly pristine, besides for the bubbles, of course. Now it's time to tackle this Packard No. 6 shutter. I will say now, I have never worked on a shutter like this before, so take everything you see more or less with a huge grain of salt. It has 4 corner screws, and I think 5 or 6, I think 6 screws that actually hold the back plate onto the shutter itself. Something very interesting I'm going to show you here, and I enjoy seeing this on a lot of the cameras I restore. The last time the shutter was either serviced or perhaps when it was made. Packard has been in business since 1885, but at any rate, there is a date and initials on one of the blades of the shutter, and I'm about to show you that now. So we're in February 2022. The last time anything was done to this, or when it was made, was March 17th, 1960. So we're coming up on 62 years since the shutter was opened up. At least I assume that's the case. Much like the lens, the shutter was in generally good shape. It was a little rough sounding. It had kind of a grind to it, which that was really due to just the dirt inside of the shutter mechanism itself. This is a No. 6 Packard. As I stated, that means it has both an automatic shutter function and a bulb shutter function, and that's what this little articulating arm controls. That pin pushes in, catches the arm, and it allows the shutter to open and close automatically somewhere around 1/25th to 1/50th of a second. Again, I had no idea how this worked, even now, and that led to a few problems, but we'll get into that later. So a quick dust out, and they say you shouldn't oil these lenses. These shutters. That was my typewriter oil. I noticed the spring had a little bit of rust on there, so I hit that with some oil and those articulation points down there because I saw they were steel as well. A little bit later on, when I was having some trouble with the shutter, I thought the oil might have had something to do with it, so I actually ended up cleaning off all the oil with some isopropyl alcohol except for the one on the spring, but it turns out that wasn't the issue at all. So again, you're not technically supposed to oil these, but I added just a little bit, and hopefully that will prevent some rust in the future. I also ended up replacing those little foam triangles at the bottom. Again, these are very old. Just replaced them with some self-adhering foam, the same stuff I use on the door of my dark room, and that works perfectly. This is the piston mechanism that operates the shutter. Again, we're going to get into this in detail a bit later. But when you replace the back of the shutter, that brass piston has 2 little holes, and that fits over the rod that sticks up from that articulating arm. So when air blasts into the piston, it raises the shutter and lowers it. Just making sure all the screws are tightened back up now. Giving the front of the flange and the lens board a little bit of a wipe off with the Zeiss wipes. It wasn't that dirty, surprisingly. The lens screws back into the flange. And at this point, the lens and the shutter are pristinely clean. Just look at that. And of course, I have to give the Aperture Blades one last go over. Next is going to be replacing the pneumatic hose and the bulb that actually will make the shutter function. This was an adventure, to say the least. I've moved back inside here, and to get a better idea of what I was doing, I switched over to the GoPro, and I'm going to tell you in advance, folks, it was a little off angle, but you can generally see what's going on. What I ended up doing was buying a blood pressure cuff off of Amazon for about 20 bucks, and I'm not trying to shy you away from buying things directly from Packard. They offer all the parts, all the bulbs, all the hoses, but to be shipped to me here in Tennessee, it was going to be about $47, and of course, I'm not made of money. But I think in the long run, it might have saved me just a little bit of headache if I'd bought that directly, but nonetheless, I'm going to show you how to do it the way I have with this blood pressure cuff and bulb. So removing the remnants of the old hose from the piston, just blowing it out for good measure. And this is the little blood pressure cuff, or sphygmomanometer to be technical, that I got from Amazon, and we are going to completely cannibalize it. I had kind of an ingenious, or I thought at the time would be ingenious idea, because the blood pressure cuff has this little valve, and that's what you're going to see here. I thought that could serve as more or less a lock for the bulb mode, but ended up causing extreme amount of problems, which you're about to see. To get started, we're just going to cut the silicone hose and bulb from the cuff here. Just use a pair of scissors. And another good thing about this is it of course has the dial on the end of the other hose, and we'll cut this off and instantly have a spare hose should anything go wrong with the first one. I make use of almost everything of this cuff, at least what I could, so not much is wasted. So here's our new hose and bulb assembly. I just trim off the little bit of nasty from the end from separating it from the cuff, and we're going to start the arduous process of trying to get this hose to go through the hole in the lens board. Now, the hose that came with this, the original hose, was much thinner, and the lumen was much larger. So after a lot of trying, a lot of prodding, I actually ended up having to just file out that hose hole to make it fit, because it's kind of finicky. You don't want it to be too tight to constrict the airflow, but at the same time you don't want that hose to be that hole to be too big around the hose, because that will allow light to come in, and that's going to completely ruin your exposure. So finally we have the hose through the board. Checking the airflow, everything seems to be fine at this point. And now I'm going to connect the end of the hose to the attachment point on the piston. I use a little bit of saliva to lubricate the sliding on of the hose. Looking back, I don't recommend you do that, or if you do that, use it very sparingly, because I ended up getting, as disgusting as it sounds, some saliva up into the piston when I figured out exactly how this works. So I had to take it all apart and, of course, clean all that out. This took quite a while. So now we have the hose connected, everything seems to be okay. And this is where a lot of the trouble begins to start. You see that valve I mentioned earlier? Actually the valve is to the left, the little cap for the bulb is on the right. I ended up having to remove those, and the reason why, that valve actually constricted the airflow so much that it wouldn't allow the shutter to fall back down. So once I took that valve off, put the hose directly into the bulb, removed the little cap off the end, everything worked perfectly. Now I want to show you exactly how this Packard No. 6 works in practice, so that's what we're going to do now. I had originally wanted to demonstrate the Packard No. 6 here outside, actually making a real photograph, but we are unfortunately under a high wind advisory today. So we're doing it inside. You might actually be able to hear it outside the window here. Yeah, it's quite the gale. So, two settings to this Packard No. 6. The first with the pin pressed in here. That is the automatic shutter mode. According to Packard, that is going to range anywhere from 1/25th to 1/50th of a second, depending on how hard you squeeze the bulb. And of course, with the pin pressed in, if you watch the video of me photographing Kurt, we touched on this briefly, that is going to block that articulating arm and engages the spring. So when the shutter comes up, the spring pulls that arm back, and then it allows the shutter to fall. Now here is where we were running into some trouble, because as I said, when I first started working on the shutter, I really didn't understand exactly how it worked. I watched some videos on Packard, but Packard's YouTube channel, that is, but there's really not a lot of information about it. I had thought the pneumatic bulb would blast in air, push that piston up, which would open the shutter, but I thought gravity more or less would just have the piston fall down. That's not how it works. The air, it's fully pneumatic. The air opens the shutter and more or less suction closes the shutter. So I think that's where I was running into some problems originally. And of course, I've been having a few finicky issues with it. I think that all came down to how I was squeezing the bulb. And I'll say this now, I'm not trying to detract from Packard. I'm not saying you shouldn't buy stuff from Packard, but their bulb, the bulb and hose combo, I think was $47 to me shipped. This bulb, like I said, the whole thing was about 20 bucks, and it is smaller than the Packard bulb that comes from the company. And I realized that according to, of course, Boyle's law with air pressure and volumes, the smaller bulb actually has a higher pressure because it's a smaller volume. This one's about 3 inches long, theirs is about 4 inches long and a lot wider. So I think I was just really squeezing the bulb too hard. Now I say all that just to say that I think I've got everything figured out with the shutter issue. I think I was just pressing the bulb too hard. The volume was going way up and essentially making that arm jump over the leaves of the shutter. So fingers crossed, I think we got that fixed. So now that all that's out of the way, let me show you how this shutter works. So with the pin pushed in, we're in automatic shutter mode. I just hold my thumb over the end of the bulb and press slightly, and there we go. Shutter opens and closes. You can actually control it to some extent with how fast you push the bulb, so slower, and now faster. Very nifty to have. This is what makes cameras like Marcus. I'm sure you've seen that video of me restoring Marcus, the Graflex speed graphic pacemaker. They have focal plane shutters, and that lets you use virtually any lens with that. Lenses such as the Kodak here with Winston, that's a barrel lens, that is, doesn't have a shutter. So that's it enables you to shoot somewhat controllably, but with a more or less conventional shutter. Now the other mode, and actually the mode I use the most with Winston here, is the bulb mode. So we pull the pin out. That's moving it out of the way of that articulating arm. So now we hold the bulb just like we did with the automatic, give it a press, let go with the thumb to let the air out, and now the shutter stays open. This is what we use for focusing. and of course with longer exposures, so there's nothing in between the lens and the actual focal plane back there, the film or the ground glass. To shut the shutter, not complicated, but it takes some practice. We're going to go on the reverse. We're going to squeeze the bulb slightly, hold my thumb over the end, and now that suction pulls it shut. So we can open, now close, and it works extremely well for the age of the shutter and the technology. This is extremely well made, and I've mentioned this before, especially if you follow me on Instagram and watch my stories. Packard is still open. They're still in business, so you can get these shutters brand new, and they're actually not that high priced, at least relatively when you think about the ease and the versatility that they allow you. So that is the Packard number 6. There's a Packard number 5. The only difference is the Packard number 5 has a bulb mode only. It does not have the automatic shutter. And then the Packard number 7, I believe, is the chronology there. That one has the automatic mode and the bulb mode like the number 6, but it also has the option for an actual flash sync, which is wild to me that you can use modern electronic flashes with these shutters. Brilliant piece of technology and craftsmanship.